And I'd like to welcome everyone really to this very important meeting about where we'll be discussing what is a very pivotal moment in British politics and talking about where next for the left moving forward. Just to introduce myself, my name is Nadia. I'm an activist in this area, mostly involved in campaigns around climate change and calling for climate action, as well as local anti-racist campaigns as well. I've been part of organising this event today, and I'll be chairing this discussion this evening. Just to explain how the meeting's going to run, for people who are new to this sort of public meeting and format, we have 4 brilliant speakers who I'll introduce one by one as they go up. And then after each of our speakers have spoken, then I'm going to be opening the floor for discussion, so questions and contributions, and I encourage everybody to save their questions and contributions for that time. We'll have plenty of space for that. Before we start, I'd just like to start with 2 apologies. So Ian Byrne, the Labour MP for Liverpool West Derby, hoped to be here tonight, but has had to be in Parliament under a 3-line whip, so won't be joining us this evening. And also from Amina Ibrahim, she also sends her apologies. She's the Vice Chair of Momentum and is a councillor in Haringey and has had to be at a very important council meeting this evening, and so won't be joining us. To move on with the discussion itself, I'm quite pleased to introduce our first speaker, Josh Hollands, who is a member of the UCU and the UCL branch of the UCU, the University and Colleges Union, who I'm excited to announce will be going on another 14 days of strike action very soon. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Josh as our first speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wow, that is quite loud, isn't it? The first thing I want to say really is thank you to a lot of people in this room, I think, who provided solidarity and support during our last round of strikes. 8 days we took in November and December. Actually, during the election, over 5 main disputes. We've got our 4 fights fighting over pay, derisory pay offer. It's effectively over 20% pay cut over the last 10 years or so. The gender disability and racial pay gaps that are quite stunning to think about when you consider higher education today. Casualisation and also our pensions. And I'm sure there's many people in this room who are also in similar positions in their workplaces who have faced similar attacks on their pay and their pension and so on. And the first thing I want to say is that I think we were actually right to strike during the election. There was I remember there was some discussion about whether that was the right thing to do, and I think it was absolutely the right thing to take action at the time of an election. It obviously, raised the spectre of industrial action against a future Johnson government, although at that time we were obviously, many of us, very hopeful that we'd be in a very different landscape now. But it also provided a vision of higher education under a Corbyn government, but also a vision that I don't think we should lose sight of. We can't lose sight of, the fight for education, not for profit. An education that won't put students into tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt, and an education system that challenges the hostile environment. It doesn't uphold racism on campus, and it challenges the notion that our education system should be invested in the climate catastrophe. And all of these things were really raised, and they can seem like they were secondary, but we held teach-outs every day. We had fantastic support from students and other groups of workers, and that was absolutely vital to sustaining our action. But I think it's also going to be even more vital now. As Nadia mentioned, we're taking 14 more days of action, and people don't take that lightly, as I'm sure many of you know in this room. That's going to be, we've already sacrificed 6% of our pay by the end of this dispute, and we're absolutely serious that if we have to, we will escalate it even further. We've just had even more branches of the UCU join after reballoting. They've successfully smashed that ridiculous anti-union threshold of 50% turnout. And I've got to say that I think, it offers us an opportunity to have a vision of where we should be in this Johnson period. We can't wait 5 more years now for Labour to come and save higher education. We can't wait for them to save our pensions. We need to be mobilising now, and I think that's what we can really take from this strike action. And we've been inspired by so many others too. The railway workers, also at UCL, the IWGB union organising some of the most oppressed workers, migrant workers who are being exploited on one of the richest campuses in this country. And it's that kind of solidarity, us marching together through the streets of central London, that I think we need to take forward in this moment. And so please do go back to, if you're in trade union, go back to your branches. If you're a university, go back to student groups at school. And let's spread the word that this is really an opportunity for us to march together. And I also don't think this should be a period of doom and gloom. I'm an American historian by trade when I'm not on strike. And I think, what Bernie Sanders is doing in the United States really offers us an opportunity to say, we can keep moving forward. It can be inspirational, and we should be pushing out that message here. We shouldn't be doom and gloom. We've had a month of that now, and now's our opportunity to really push forward. And I've got to say, we won't stop at UCL. We won't stop in the UCU until we do roll back that tide of casualisation, of exploitation of some of the most oppressed in society. And but we're not all rich professors, as you might think. Many of us are on casualised contracts for years and years, on 0-hour contracts. So please do go back to your branches, do go back to your schools, perhaps do collections, and come down to our picket lines, because we want to really kick off that this Johnson era with a wave of strike action that unites society. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Josh again for kicking off that discussion. To introduce our next speaker, we have Noga Levy-Rapoport, who is one of the main organisers in UK School Student Climate Network. This is the group, the national group across the country that's been organising the amazing climate strikes that have really been a huge part of why climate change now is back on the mainstream political agenda. And so I'd like to invite everyone to give a very warm round of applause to Noga.
Thanks. Oh gosh, that is really loud. I'm Noga. I've been organising the climate strikes here for the past year, and we're currently coming up to our 1-year anniversary for the next global climate strike, which is next Friday on Valentine's Day. We've spent our time organising, having been forced into a more non-partisan kind of campaigning, having relied on a lot of NGOs to push us up into kind of the political stratosphere and ensure that actually we do get some kind of access to Parliament. So now, post-election, is really the time for a lot of climate strikers to take a step back and think, how can we ensure that as we organise around the left, we don't fall too deep into party politics? And I think that's really important. We've seen the shortcomings of the Labour Party, however fantastic much of it might be. And we know, and Josh, you said this as well, we can't wait for a general election in 5 years' time. And so what we're hoping to focus on is actually the combination of both education and action. We'll be pulling on the power of young people and the importance of education in our lives to connect really 500 years of colonial violence with the climate crisis that's taking place today. And that means that even at the very roots of the left, there needs to be a greater understanding around how we got here and the colonialism and imperialism that created this. And there are, even still in left spaces, there are still people who lack the understanding that if we want to move towards a more secure, equitable future, the Green New Deal that we're calling for relies not just on a just transition for people here, but it's so deeply rooted in internationalism that we have to resist any form of green colonialism that is offered to us within the next 5 years, because it will be. It will be offered by this government. And that requires a much greater form of resistance than we've taken part in this past year. And it requires not just organising from young people, but it requires organising at a level that we tried to achieve on the September 20th global climate strike. And we were very lucky from the amount of incredible union organisers that joined us that day, particularly those who took wildcat action. And that is an incredible feat, I think, in a country that has been that has had its workers so belittled by the anti-trade union laws, both from Thatcher and from Cameron, of course. And I have absolutely no doubt that Johnson will continue to implement those laws. And so this resistance relies on being risky. It relies on taking that chance. It relies on being creative around how we organise. It relies on taking actions like the BP or not BP action this Saturday in central London. That's a result of several climate organisations together who are putting much of their jobs at risk, and many of them don't have the protection of a union. It relies on start-up unions. There are, I don't know if anyone's seen, but recently there was a start-up union of those who are working against domestic violence against women. That's what we need to be pushing forward right now. And across the country, we're currently working on forming loosely based youth unions almost, in order to protect students who may be penalised by their schools for walkouts. And we're hoping that this will ensure the safety of students and secure their rights within the next 5 years, considering the escalation that we're hoping will happen. And so what I guess I'm both asking for and relaying here is that the next year in particular is a difficult one. We have in December COP26, obviously the crucial UN climate negotiations. They're taking place obviously in Glasgow, where XR Scotland have done an incredible job so far of occupying fossil fuel infrastructure, calling on local trade unions and working actively with local communities in order to ensure there is an active just transition up in Scotland, and that fossil fuel industries will be a thing of the past. They are not, that we are not just an irritant in Johnson's face, but rather a blasting foghorn in the ears of his government. And so what we really need to look to in this year is building the groundwork. We have a year. It's not a lot, but we have a year to lay down the foundations of what can be incredible movements over the next 5 years. We have a year to show our strength and solidarity and internationalism in December this year, and we have that year to connect. And I think Britain, in all its historic responsibility for the many horrors of the world, still we sometimes fail to be internationalist to the extent that we understand our own implicity in what is going on. And I think that if we are truly to pull the left together within the next year, we have to maintain more than just passive internationalism, but we have to create a resistance that is rooted in solidarity across the world, because that's not what makes the headlines, unfortunately. And that's exactly why we need it, because it is something that will be shunned by the government and by many Labour MPs too, because it is something that will be shunned by those across the left who would perhaps look to Keir Starmer, for example, as a prime ministerial leader, and because it is something that we need to organise around, particularly freedom of movement post-Brexit in all its no-deal disaster, which, of course, we all know this is where it's kind of heading. And so this is a momentous year. It is a year that we'll be organising in. It is a year that will be escalating from strikes to many more actions. It is a year in which we'll be showing all our sheer power in December, and hopefully it is a year in which I can see everyone in this room on the streets with both me and my classmates, but actively tearing down those anti-trade union laws and building that foundation, setting out those building blocks, stepping out onto those stones of resistance and allowing for 5 years in which we are ready to take back not just Parliament, but to take back the empathy and compassion that we have been missing as a country for so long, and to take back real unity and real solidarity and build a resistance that is not just envied, but is appreciated and desperately required by so many other parts of the world in which vulnerable people are suffering and will continue to suffer if we do not pull ourselves together.
That was absolutely fantastic, and I'm also very impressed, all done without notes at all as well. I am very excited. Also, sorry, before moving on to the next speaker, in solidarity with the work that UKSEN have done and carry on doing, I would also like to encourage everybody to join them and lots of others next Friday for the climate strikes. How long is, I'm not even going to try to guess what number of climate strikes it's been so far. I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. Mark Serwotka is the General Secretary of the Public and Commercial Services Union, and he'll be following on that discussion. But if people can give a very warm round of applause for Mark Serwotka.
Well, thanks very much. Can I say 2 fantastic opening speeches? And I want to first of all congratulate the organisers. I think if ever there was a time when we need to be meeting around the country discussing which way for the left, now is it. What I want to try and do in my contribution is to raise what I think the left really needs to do. We need political clarity. We do need discussion. We do need to understand what's gone on in the last few years, what went wrong, what went right. But whilst we're seeking political clarity and debate, we need to mobilize activity and action, and we need to be lifting people's spirits and morale by inspiring people that the game is not up for 5 years. In fact, in many ways, it is about to really kick off. And our role as socialists who want to do something is understanding that connecting these discussions, these debates, and these campaigns is the key to ensuring that the working class can make advances in the next 4 or 5 years, and we're not paralyzed by defeatism and demoralism and being demoralized and just think there's nothing we can do till 2024. So that being the case, what I'm particularly excited about is that we're having a meeting when we are about to go into another set of climate strikes, when the UCU, and just pause to think what you said there, have announced 14 days of strikes. We've already had 8 days of strikes. That's 22 days of industrial action by workers across the UK. And I think we should recognise what an incredible commitment and brave stance that is. Yesterday, the Communication Workers Union announced that they will not be cowed by the decision of the courts and they will reballot. I believe that they will win that ballot with a massive majority and they will again smash the threshold. In my own union, we have a strike that has just started, 1 month, industrial action at the Foreign Office, where we have workers who are maintenance staff, cleaners and caterers, the people who often get forgotten, out on strike for a month. They've already had masses of industrial action. It is over the issue of trade union recognition in the private sector in a government department. And if I could just say, anyone who is in London on any day, they pick it every single day, but next week on the 11th, we're trying to mobilize quite a big presence where we hopefully will have some key speakers to come and boost those strikers. So things are happening. But I want to really kick off by recognizing that if the left is going to have a debate about what to do, doesn't mean we don't get active and fight back, but it is that debate that is quite important, because we have entered a new period, and I think we have to reflect and understand the period we all operate in, whether you're a climate activist, a trade unionist, whether you're fighting against the ravages of universal credit or fighting to save jobs. The last 2 years has been dominated by a radical leader of the Labour Party, a minority Conservative government, routinely losing votes in Parliament, where that political situation was more fluid and mixed up than we have seen for many years. Labour's membership has risen to 580,000, by far the biggest membership of any political party, and we fought an election with the most radical manifesto in my lifetime, even more radical, I would argue, than Michael Foot's manifesto. So we've been through incredibly exciting times, and whether you're in the Labour Party or not, we all hoped in December we would see Corbyn in number 10 and that we were going to organise the battles to defend a radical government that was going to try and transform many people's lives. So I think we should recognise the shattering blow that was the election defeat and how many people have received that. And we do need to debate why that happened and not just think it's a Labour Party issue. I think there's a collective Labour movement issue around how we related to the divisions in the working class around Brexit, how the Labour Party went from a very carefully crafted position, as did the TUC, after the referendum, which was to respect the result but fight to defend jobs, fight to defend freedom of movement and other things that you've mentioned, to in the last year, when many people, including, and I include myself in this, got caught up in the parliamentary theatrics that you literally could see the government fall, the position rapidly fast-forwarded with gay abandon to a second referendum and Remain. And the debate I think we need to have is understanding what effect that's had on working class people, particularly in those seats that everybody talks about, and how we have to reconnect. Now, it's not just about Brexit. I think there's a piece of work to be done and ask ourselves, if you look at those red wall seats that Labour lost, from Blyth right through the Midlands and into North Wales, we need to ask ourselves, what is trade union membership like in those constituencies? What has happened in these places that have seen deindustrialization, the contraction of the trade union movement, and not the sense of activity and solidarity that we would have seen when unions and jobs were certainly more secure, and a trade union movement was collectively bringing people together in those communities. So I believe Brexit was a big factor, but I actually think that disconnect started under Tony Blair, probably goes back even further, and many of those voters were disenchanted with Labour, and the Brexit position pushed them over the edge. So I think we have to discuss that, and we have to debate it moving forward as a left. But I think whilst we're having that discussion, and therefore I would say that I do think it is important how we relate to the Labour leadership election. I understand none of the candidates are Jeremy Corbyn, but in a party of 580,000, the key for the left would seem to me to be whether the Labour leader believes in and is convinced about public ownership, redistribution of wealth, scrapping universal credit, scrapping the anti-union laws, or they want to take the Labour Party back to the centre. It's not the be-all and end-all of everybody's waking moments, but I think we should intervene in that discussion and argue for the bold socialist policies that were put forward and argue that they are maintained. And I think that's an important debate. And with 580,000 members, I can tell you that some of the meetings I've been to are huge meetings. Some of the debates about whether it's Keir Starmer or Rebecca Long-Bailey are not 20 people above a pub. They are 500 or 600 people having to register to get in a venue. So there's a real political debate taking place, and I think we have to be able to relate and intervene in that debate. But what I want to really talk about now is, whilst that debate takes place and we have to intervene in it, we should recognise that we don't have a minority government. We now have Boris Johnson with a majority, very friendly with Donald Trump, and we are about to see a Conservative government that was fairly paralysed. They were still doing some pretty awful things. But I can tell you, in my own union in the civil service, they didn't see through some of their attacks because they did not have a majority. We must now prepare that they are going to go on the offensive, and they are going to go on the offensive very rapidly. And the big challenge for our movement and the left has to be, we cannot allow a defeatism that I have already seen in meetings of senior trade union leaders, not everybody, but some, that is reminiscent of 1984, when we saw Margaret Thatcher win an election and then the miners defeated after a one-year-long heroic struggle. We had a period in our movement called New Realism and defeatism that essentially said we can't win anymore. Now, we have to make sure that we're the ones arguing we can win. Majority of 86 or not, working class people can win. We can win in terms of climate action. We can defend refugees. We can fight to get rid of this benefit system, and we can win industrially. But to do that, we've got to be on the front foot. Therefore, anyone here who's in a union, I think you have a particular responsibility at the moment in your union branches and workplaces to be recognizing that now's not the time for a period of introspection and to keep our heads down. Now, I raise this because the government is about to launch the most brazen, provocative attack on public sector workers' pensions that I think requires a very, very clear and bold response. The government's response on pensions, where all public sector workers currently should have had improvements to their pensions because of public sector pension valuations. The government has put it all on hold because they lost a legal case to the firefighters. They are about to tell workers that in order to put that right, workers will have to pay themselves to cover the government's illegality. In other words, whatever scheme you are in, instead of getting the improvements that you should get from your pension schemes, it is all going to be foregone in order for the government to put right its illegality. In other words, if you think about it, you're all currently being robbed. That robbery will continue, and the money they're robbing off you will be used for them to put right their injustice by discriminatory pension schemes. Why is that important? Because that affects every public sector worker, whatever part of the public sector you're in, if you're in a public sector scheme, and it must require a united trade union response. So whether you are in Unison, PCS, the NEU, or whether you are in Unite or the GMB or any of the other unions, it is the best chance we've had since 2010-11, when, if those who can remember, we had 2 million people on strike, 29 unions over the question of pensions. Why do I raise that here? Because it is an immediate industrial provocation the government's about to bring, that if it doesn't get an immediate, angry and organised response, means the government is going to get away with it. And I raise this about where now for the left, because I can tell you in the meetings I'm attending, some people seem to be up for that fight, but others are saying now is not the time. And if we try to go too hard to fight back, they will make things even worse. The phrase, pick your battles, is now a common phrase everywhere. And actually, what I think our role has to be is to say, well, let's look at France. French workers have just defeated Macron over increasing the pension age. So where I'm going and where I'll sort of wind up with all of that is that we have the climate struggle. We have unions on strike now who are fighting back. We're about to have a huge provocation of the public sector trade union movement, which is nearly 5 million strong. We have rail workers, the RMT, who have reballoted and won 6 times. The same workers have voted for strike to beat the anti-union threshold. They have now realized they won't defeat those workers, so they're going to change the law to make it harder for them to go on strike. My view about where now for the left has to be we've got to resist. We've got to have those struggles, whether they're small and local or global, industrial or political, and bring people together and fight back. No struggle is too small for us to get in and support. No struggle is too big for us to frighten ourselves into thinking that we can't win. And the vanguard of the left, people who believe this and want to do something about it, therefore need to participate in political debate to ensure we win the argument about being radical politically, but we need to root ourselves in these struggles. And I'll leave you, therefore, with this thought about how my own union is approaching this at the moment. We're about to launch a national campaign, hopefully leading to a national strike ballot, to defend our members' pay, pensions, and redundancy rights. We've tried twice in the last 2 years and come agonizingly close in the biggest ballots in Britain since the new laws came in to get over the 50% threshold, and last time we were less than 1.2% short. We're just launching a campaign that I think should be the motto for the left moving forward. It is not just rerunning the same whole thing and hoping you get an extra 2%. We've recognized the key to winning is participation and activity locally in the workplace that doesn't get restricted by structures or rules or constitutions, that asks people to come together and get involved. And we are about to launch throughout Britain a series of local campaigning organizations to get more and more people involved to deliver local campaigning and fight backs. I tell you what happens if we are successful. More people will join the union, more people will get involved in the union will grow, and the union will win the ballot and win the strike. If that's our model to winning our industrial action ballot, what would that look like if we did that to fight racism, we did that to fight climate change, if we did that to support unions who are on strike, and we did that to join up students, workers, and all of those campaignings. So to me, it's about debate and political clarity, but it is about activity and fighting back, large and small. And if the left does that, we will win, we will grow, and we can defeat the attacks that Boris Johnson's planning.
Very big thank you again to Mark, and we'll be hearing from Mark and all of our speakers at the end of the meeting. I'd like to introduce our final speaker for this session, and then we'll move on to a discussion. Our final speaker is going to be Charlie Kimber, who is the editor of Socialist Worker.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks to all our speakers. We're all comrades on this platform. We shook hands beforehand. We're not going to be tearing up one another's speeches afterwards. It's an important discussion. What changed on the 12th of December? Two things changed. One was the end of an era in which the focus of politics was Jeremy Corbyn and the prospect of a left Labour government. The second thing was the end of an era in which the Tories did not have a stable parliamentary majority. I think people still haven't woken up to that. We're much closer now to a situation that existed in the 1980s, when the Thatcher government, in parliamentary terms, could do what it wanted. And therefore, the locus of resistance cannot be in Parliament, cannot be around the Labour Party. That doesn't mean that what happened in the election doesn't matter. It does matter. I think Mark is right to say we have to interrogate what happened in that election result. It's not an accident that 52 of the 54 seats that Labour lost to the Tories in England and Wales were in places that had voted Leave. I think Mark's right about what happened around Brexit, and that it was completely wrong for the Labour Party to adopt a policy of a second referendum. That wasn't the only thing that mattered. I think the disgusting and disreputable use of anti-Semitism slurs against Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and the fact that Labour gave in to those and compromised with those slurs was important. I think the actions of a hostile and disgusting right-wing media was, of course, important. I think the actions of Labour councils implementing cuts and attacking ordinary working class people was important. Too often, workers were forced to strike not against Tory councils, but against Labour councils that were cutting their jobs and their wages. And if, for example, you were in Durham in northeast England, where regrettably Laura Pidcock lost her seat, one of the big memories for people in that area is the Labour council cutting the jobs and wages and conditions of thousands of working class women who worked as teaching assistants. And that can't help that your direct experience of the Labour Party is it tearing up your life. And it's absolutely true as well. It's a long-term trend. One statistic, in 1992, 59% of people in the DE social category, the lowest category, the worst paid, the people on benefits, pensioners and so on, 59% of them voted for the Labour Party. In 2019, 39% of them voted for the Labour Party. That is a huge shift, and it's not about Jeremy Corbyn. The one person who bucked the downward trend amongst that category was Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. It's about Tony Blair, it's about Gordon Brown, it's about Ed Miliband, it's about a Labour Party which turned its back on working class people because it thought they had nowhere else to go except to vote for them, and unfortunately, they were wrong about that calculation. And this isn't just about electoral politics, because if we're not going to focus on what's happening in the Labour Party, we have to talk seriously about resistance. That's why the question of the climate is important. Anyone who watched over Christmas what was happening in Australia knows that the fact that a continent can become uninhabitable is now easily imaginable. Anyone who saw the flooding in Indonesia knows that Jakarta, an area, the greater Jakarta is an area of 30 million people, is being abandoned by the government as it sinks beneath the water. Anyone who watched what happened with Cyclone Idai, not so much remarked on because it happened in Africa, 4,000 people killed by Cyclone Idai, perhaps the biggest climate event ever in the southern hemisphere, knows that when people talk about we have a decade left to change things, it's not scaremongering, it is about reality. And therefore, we know that it's not going to happen if you ever thought it was going to happen, by the election of a Labour Party government. It can only happen by the sorts of events that Noga spoke about. And that means a much bigger scale of resistance that we have at the moment. I mean, I think it was brilliant what happened on the 20th of September last year with trade unionists becoming involved around it. But let's be clear about it. I want the trade unions and workers involved around the question of the climate. The point is not for the school students and students to start listening to trade unionists and do what the trade unionists. The point is for trade unionists to rise to the level of what the school students and XR have done. And we need to recognise who's in the leadership in that, and we need to adopt the insurgent, intransigent, creative methods that XR and others have shown through the school strikes, through the XR demonstration on the 22nd of February, through the next big international day, which is probably going to be on the 4th of April, right up until the COP conference in Glasgow in November. And that is a crucial job for all of us to be involved in. I think the question of anti-racism is absolutely central. How did Johnson begin? With the deliberate cruelty of deciding that a few hundred children, unaccompanied refugees, who might have the possibility of perhaps coming to join their families in Britain, should deliberately be excluded as they pushed through the Brexit bill. Why? Not because, even if you believed it, there were floods of people who were going to come to Britain. It was an indication to his MPs and to his supporters, we are going to use brutal racism in order to try and shore up our rule, to distract people from the real issues in society, and to try and break the resistance against us. So the same reason that this week they've begun the deportation flights to Jamaica again. And we know this has an effect. That's why there are the examples of racist graffiti, of anti-Semitic graffiti, of attacks upon Muslims and Jews that are taking place in Britain. And therefore we need a big anti-racist movement. The demonstrations in London and Glasgow on the 21st of March are central to that, but we need anti-racist organisation in every area of Britain and in every area of our work and wherever we organise. And we also need, crucially, resistance in the workplace and on the streets. I know Mark is committed to ensuring that there will be a national strike in the PCS, and if there had not been those trade union laws, we would already have had at least one national strike inside the PCS, and probably a national strike in the National Education Union, and a national strike amongst Royal Mail workers, although we should note that the law that stopped the strikes in the Royal Mail was not the latest round of Tory anti-union laws. It was the one that was passed in 1992. It was maintained by every Labour government afterwards. And that's why it's crucial that the UCU is going to come out on strike, and we need full solidarity with them. That's why we need to support the PCS comrades when they fight and when they ballot. It's crucial we get behind the Royal Mail workers, because, I mean, I'm all for bold speeches. I make lots of bold speeches. But we need concrete action as well. You know, what will make a difference is not how often we say we need resistance, it's how often we get resistance. And therefore, for example, the fact that the United Voices of the World strikers at St Mary's Hospital in West London, 200 of them going on strike for 9 days, nearly all of them migrant workers, won not just better pay or conditions or sick pay, but destroyed outsourcing, not just for themselves, the 200, but for 1,000 workers across Imperial Trust. That's the sort of victory that we need. And don't let anyone tell me that migrant workers reduce workers' wages and conditions. Those 200 migrant workers have improved workers' conditions, not just for themselves, but for the whole of the working class, because they've shown how it's possible to fight and to win. And we need more of those sorts of things. But we also need to think about the unexpected things. You see, in 2017, the French presidential election took place, The most popular candidate on the left got 20% of the vote. The equivalent of the Labour Party got 6% of the vote and came fifth. The runoff was between Emmanuel Macron, the darling of the neoliberal left, and the fascist Marine Le Pen. That's quite a low ebb, let me tell you, electorally. 18 months later, the Yellow Vest movement emerged. Nobody saw the Yellow Vest movement coming. It was highly contradictory, there were problems with it, there was arguments inside it and so on. But it showed that there was a revolt inside society. Nobody knew that was going to happen. And a year later, we have mass strikes against the Macron government. No, I'm not saying that will happen here, but come on. We need to raise our sights about what's possible. And nobody really knew that we'd see the great revolts in Chile, or Hong Kong, or Lebanon, or Iraq, or Guinea in West Africa, and the list goes on. But the point is not just will there be resistance, the point is what the politics of those resistance will be. Because I don't think the crucial thing about the resistance is to try and make sure that Rebecca Long-Bailey becomes the leader of the Labour Party. I don't think the crucial thing about the resistance is to create conditions in which in 5 years we can win an election. Because we have to ask ourselves, why did the Labour Party make all those concessions towards the critics that were made? Why did it give in over the question of Brexit? And my argument will be, is that's what Labourism looks like. That's what, when you have a party that is fixated on Parliament rather than the struggle, that looks towards, crucially, a bit of extra parliamentary struggle, but the thing that disciplines everything is what happens inside the parliamentary chamber, and therefore the unity of the party, the concessions to the right, the necessity to keep things together is what's poisonous inside this sort of situation. And therefore we need to say we need a different sort of politics, not based upon what the Labour Party does, but based crucially, beginning foremost with a massive pressure on what happens in the streets and the workplaces, not inside the House of Commons. And that's what's been exciting, surely, about the climate movement. That's what's been exciting about many of the examples of global revolts at the moment. It's what's exciting about what's happening in France. France is not about people saying, we hope we do better in the municipal elections, or that we do better in the next presidential election. It's about people saying, our lives are being ripped up, we are going to do something about it. And that seems to me the argument we have to have in the movement. Are we going to come away from this thinking that the target is going to be the London mayoral election or the county council elections or the next general election? Or are we going to try and build a movement that draws on the best of the climate rebellion, the anti-racist movement, the anti-austerity movement, the strikes that are bound to happen in the period ahead, to found a movement which is strong enough to put forward a stronger socialist challenge inside all the movements that are happening and bring them together to say that we can't have a decent world when the priorities are decided by billionaires, and we can't have a decent world where it's divided up by national boundaries. We need an internationalist movement based upon genuine socialist ideas, and that's the task that we have to set ourselves.
But really for me, the one thing that came out of the election campaign and the election results itself was really that we can't be relying on Parliament at the moment. And I really felt that before, but I was a big supporter of Corbyn, and in my school, amongst my teacher friends, within the National Education Union I'm a member of, I think it's really important that we're talking about trade unions at the moment. We all loved Jeremy Corbyn, and we were all, standing at the printers in the morning saying, he's going to win, he's going to win. And so we really, really supported them. And I think the main thing now is, with the fallout of the election, we just have to say we can't wait. We said it before when the Tories got elected last time, we can't wait 5 years. We really can't wait 5 years. In my school, the cuts are absolutely catastrophic. We are in a situation where we are often way beyond the capacity of class sizes, cuts to teaching assistants, cuts to middays, and even in the context where you stand up and fight, we're dealing with a broken system at the moment. We have to be going we have to be going beyond this. And we really, yes, we can fight it school by school, and the individual examples of strikes are important, but we need to be talking more and more about national action and national industrial action. In schools as well, it goes beyond cuts. It's about curriculum changes. This is ideological. It's about telling children that they shouldn't be learning about the arts or about philosophy or about big ideas, about climate catastrophe. It's the test-driven system, the SATs tests in primary school, which really create huge mental health problems and anxiety. And it's the privatization of our whole education system, selling off schools, academies, and so on, which just, been completely putting profit into it. And so I think, again, we really supported Corbyn. 10 million people voted for Corbyn. I think that's really important to remember, actually. He was massively, massively popular with people, but we need more than that. In my union, we currently have a leadership that was made up of the left within the union. And that was brilliant. It's great. However, I think what that's really shown is that even when you have a left-wing leadership, that's not enough. Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary Trotsky, talked about, the main divide in a trade union isn't between the left and the right, but between those at the top and the rank and file. And I think, we can really say at the moment we need to return back to this rank and file way of organizing. Well, yes, it's great to have people like Mark here on the panel who are, good left-wing trade union bureaucrats. We need to be going beyond that. In the US, teachers have been self-organizing. They've been going out on strike. They've been winning battles against Trump in red states, in Trump voting states. So I think the climate strikers really show us the way. We need to be taking that into our workplaces. And, let's say next year we're getting together and talking about when we're going to have our next big day of climate strike.
I work at London Underground and I'm a member of the RMT. I very much feel that this is not a time for showing weakness, being half-hearted, or sitting around feeling depressed, and certainly not, as everyone said, it's not a time for talking about waiting for 5 years. The day after the election in my workplace, the same as most places, I think there was a despondency, a fear, a worry of we've got a much stronger Conservative government coming for us now, what's going to happen? But quite quickly, I feel that within my region, the London Transport region, we've been able to think quickly and recognise that it's a time to be active and not passive. We haven't put any of it into action yet, but at least we've got the thoughts about it, that it's not a time for despair. My region held its first regional council this month, and it was very heartening to see there was a really high level of political discussion. We took on the issues of where we immediately are. We know that we're the immediate target of anti-trade union laws, where we're going to be attacked as rail unions with the minimum service requirement. We put 5 different motions, 5 different resolutions were put there, and they were all passed as we decided to, as someone said, throw the kitchen sink at it. Let's think of everything we can do, and let's start to think now. Let's think about what demands we will make on Mayor Khan, that he doesn't automatically have our support, because no, we don't want a Tory mayor, but we're not going to give you our support unless you're going to demand a TfL subsidy is reinstated, that you're going to guarantee that if that law comes in, that the minimum requirement on London Underground and on rail transport will be a 0 requirement, that we do make these demands, that we ask the TUC, that we make demands on Labour leadership, but also that we begin to think a bit like what Mark was talking about there, like a whole different localised, you could be brave enough to say, a rank and file organisation across union is what's needed right now.
Next, can we hear from, a friend in the mustard jumper, and then we're going to take a contribution from yourself.
First of all, I thought it was a great introduction. I just, coming from a workplace that's not unionised yet, so obviously baby steps, I'd love to get there. I work in customer service for an exam board. It's quite boring, not very political, but actually a lot of the people who we answer the phone to are rich Tories, and the way they speak to us, I definitely don't want them running the country anymore. I want them out. But but basically, interestingly, during the election, it really raised the politics in the workplace, and there was a lot of debates and discussions taking place. And I think, as a socialist, I saw my role as kind of trying to provide, partake in these discussions and debates. I managed to convince people, quite a few people on my team, to vote Labour. Obviously, the election happened, and they were like, "Why did you tell us to do that?" But I managed to, rather than just despair, I tried to provide some clarity, and actually managed to get some people on the protest, stand up to racism protest against Boris Johnson. We have daily discussions at lunch now about politics, about ways to fight for change. I'm trying to get people on the climate strikes, and so I think this is baby steps. I'd love to obviously get people to join a union. I think this is the beginning of that, and I think it just goes to show that even in a workplace you don't feel as political. Actually, there's so much anger out there. People in my workplace are on above living wage, but still some of them can't afford, at the end of the month, barely can afford to get to work because the transport's so expensive. And I think we have to, at every opportunity, raise these discussions and raise the politics in the workplace, because actually you'd be surprised. You can get people on protest. You've got to turn the role of socialists, I think, at the moment is really to turn that despair into action. And I think there's ample opportunities. There's the climate strikes. There's the stand up to racism protests in March. I definitely will be getting people on that. And I think if I can do it, anyone else in that kind of workplace can as well.
I'm Tom. I'm a Unison rep at a school in Tower Hamlets. People might have seen in the news this week that the Liverpool mayor, Joe Anderson, made an announcement that he wasn't going to hand on any more Tory cuts. And, that was a heartening thing to see when you think that in the aftermath of the election defeat, Corbyn said that the Labour Party was going to become the resistance. The experience of people in Tower Hamlets, though, unfortunately, is really different. That actually the Labour Party isn't a resistance to austerity in Tower Hamlets. For us, the Labour Party is threatening to take our unions to court because we're trying to strike over their attempts to make us 60% easier to sack and to change our terms and conditions. It's not a case of us being able to wait for the Labour Party in 5 years. It's the fact that over the past year, we've been fighting tooth and nail to stop the Labour Party from turning us into fodder for Johnson's announcement of 5% cuts across all departments, because we know that austerity isn't over. Our indicative ballot, our statutory ballot is now open. I'm confident that we'll meet the threshold to take action, and when we do so, I hope that people give us solidarity and support. But I also want to talk a little bit about what we've done in my workplace to try and build the union, because I know it's not the case that every workplace has got disputes happening and that kind of thing, and it can be difficult when there isn't an immediate reason to strike for people to organise. But in my school, we've done action and solidarity around the climate strikes and in support of the school students. We've collected money for refugees in Calais. We've taken part in the stand-up to racism demonstrations. We've raised solidarity with other unions, sending a message of support to the UCU picket line, and also a message of support to the CWU workers in the Merseyside when they went out on unofficial strike over a racist comment by a manager. What a brilliant thing to see people taking workplace action on, by the way. So I suppose what I want to say is that if you're in a workplace and you don't have a massive dispute, there's lots of things that you can do in order to try and raise confidence and get people around you, so that when the fights come, like Mark outlines, that you're well prepared and organised. So one thing you could start by doing is raising the fact that in Tower Hamlets there's 5,000 workers being threatened by legal action by a Labour council, and then go on to support with the climate strikes and so on. Thank you.
Yep. And then we'll hear from friend over there. Yep.
Yeah, I'm Candy Edwin, and I'm on the PCS National Executive. And I think the speakers tonight have laid us down a challenge, really, because I think we need to be demanding national action, but also we have to be trying to deliver it.
and we can't necessarily deliver it nationally, but we have to do what we can. What are we going to do on February the 14th? In central London, we're trying to organise PCS members to join the student strike on February the 14th. What are we doing to support the UCU strikers? Because they're out the front and their picket lines are an absolute bloody inspiration. So anybody we can get in contact with them, it'll help us. And you know what Mark and I are trying to do in PCS is to do, in a national union, build something from the bottom up that can try and unleash that anger in a way that some of the pop-up unions have done, and not just be people who are trying to do things from the top down. But I've got a question, which is about Corbyn's army and what's going to happen to them. Some of them are in the Labour Party, some of them are supporters, some of them are active inside. And it's easy to be critical, but what my biggest frustration with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership is that he broke the consensus over austerity, but he didn't break the mould of how he organised that army of supporters. I think Momentum fell into the same trap as well, of turning that army into people who knocked on people's doors during the election, but not necessarily turn that army into people who are trying to get people out on February the 14th, or say, you know, taking climate action or building a mass movement. And so I think we've got a challenge for how, because a lot of those people, you know, people are doing different things. They're throwing themselves, and it is important, into Rebecca Long-Bailey's campaign, or they're deciding they're going to leave the Labour Party, or, you know, looking around for what they're going to do next. And I think key, obviously, number one, is to get everybody involved in the challenge of trying to build that mass movement. But I also think that there's a debate, and we're sometimes very bad on the left in having debates in a very sectarian way. We've had a lot of it in PCS recently. But I think we need a really open debate where people can really look at, why didn't that army get mobilised in the right way? Was it the result of the electoralism of the Labour Party? What are the next steps? You know, we need. I think it's brilliant that we're having this debate here, and I don't think we should shy away from having a very high level of political discussion at the same time as we try and unite around the action that we're going to need to take.
Thank you. If we hear from the speaker here, and then at the back row, if you can just wave your hands for the roaming white. Yep, you. Yeah, that order.
These meetings are really important, it seems to me. And if you look at the composition of the platform, where we have a militant trade unionist leading a militant trade union, we have a trade union with Josh that is going into another round of battle, and above all, we have a representative of somebody who is committed to standing against what is happening to our climate. And that's really, I think, the key to answer the despair that most of us felt on that terrible evening of December the 12th. I mean, you know, I'm sure you've all got stories about it and so on. So there is absolutely no doubt that the way forward is by unity in action over this and anti-racism and so on. But because the defeat is so shattering, we have to also ask the question, why did it happen? Why did it happen? And I believe we cannot avoid the argument about the strategy of Labour and Labourism. Not necessarily Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn, as we all know, is surrounded by a nest of vipers in his own party, who hate him more than they hate Boris Johnson or Theresa May. But you see, what the flaw in that strategy showed is that when the Scunthorpe steelworks were threatened with closure, why didn't Jeremy go up to Scunthorpe and immediately call a national demonstration demanding the immediate nationalisation of the steel industry. When Bridgend, Mark, in your part of the world was threatened with closure, why didn't we have the entire shadow cabinet, the entire general council of the TUC going down there and saying this is going to happen over our dead bodies? And the reason I'm sorry to say, and this is the experience of 100 years, is that Labour puts getting into office more importantly than getting into power. And power does not lie, I'm sorry to say, we've got to take on this argument, does not lie within Parliament. It lies in France, in what we can see in France. It lies in what is happening in Chile. And actually, it also lies in our own history. Think, Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1987 with the largest majority. By 1990, she was gone. Why? Not because of votes in Parliament, but because there was a mass movement on the street, the poll tax, that destroyed her government. That's the sort of vision we have to have.
Can you sum up, please?
As long as we also recognise that we have to unite as well, but we have to unite and argue, not just unite and not argue.
Right, so...
Hi, my name's Rob Ferguson. Over the last, what seems a long 3 years, I've found myself organising alongside comrades in the Labour Party, in Palestine Solidarity, in Stop the War Coalition, in academia and elsewhere, against the slanders and slurs against particularly the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, but also the wider left, over anti-Semitism. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences of the retreats and concessions over this question within Labour is that those attacks are now beginning to be levelled against on a wider scale against the left in general and beyond. So the Communities Secretary, Robert Gendrick, has announced that if local authorities and universities fail to adopt the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, they could be subject to funding cuts. The government has announced that local authorities and public institutions will not be able to adopt their own policy regarding boycott, disinvestment and sanctions. And whilst that is clearly levelled at Palestinian solidarity, it has wider implications. For example, in terms of divestment from fossil fuel companies over climate change and so forth. I think there are lessons from this that we are going to have to apply today and here and now. One is that you stand your ground. You stand your ground over academic freedom in the universities, over free speech, over Palestine solidarity, over divestment and boycott, over BDS, but also over fossil fuel companies and so forth. And there is, I think, a second lesson, because part of this attack is aiming to divide our side. To divide, for example, the anti-racist movement. Today, the Show Racism, the Red Card, has come under attack for promoting a competition, the judges of whom will be Michael Rosen and Ken Loach, a schools competition on anti-racism, because those two judges are seen as somehow not fit because of their political position on Palestine and anti-Semitism. This has to be resisted, but it also has to be resisted in a way that doesn't reinforce the divisions that people are trying to make. We have to unite against Johnson's racists, against the far right, against any rearing of the head of fascism, amongst anyone who will take a stand, even where they disagree on other questions of principle. We have to unite, because that is how you build a movement, by taking a stand on principle, but at the same time maximising your forces against attacks.
Yeah, hi, Helen Davis. I'm in Unison and I'm on the NEC, and actually I've been on the NEC since the pension strike of 2011, which seems a hell of a long time ago, and I'm quite intrigued by Mark's rallying call around the question of pensions again, because I do think that we are in very, very marked different times to back then in 2011. And what we have experienced in our union is, in one sense, there isn't a diminishing of anger and bitterness, but we have had, over 10 years, we've seen an erosion of organisation because of, people have lost their jobs, frankly. And not just that, there is also a massive erosion in terms of confidence about being able to take on any big battles, because there just haven't been any big battles, or far too few. So the arguments that is posed by my union, which is, oh no, well, we could. I mean, they treated the whole, the Corbyn few years that as like a interruption into the real programme, which is, this is as good as it gets, with Ed Miliband, as I say, and they want a return to that because it feels very safe. But I encounter those sorts of arguments with workers as well. And I think that is the reality of when there has been so little struggle over the years, then it's really hard convincing people. And I know that there is struggle going on. I know there are successful fights going on, but the vast majority of my members are not reading that, and they're not getting access to that. And we try and do our best to promote it, but it doesn't make people feel that it's happening. So I do think, therefore, that when we're talking about the climate change protests and the anti-racism protests, it's not just that there's an urgency around that, but I think that is what projects itself across society and then becomes tangible for workers and large swathes of people to believe, we can do something, other people are taking stuff on.
Please sum up.
And that is, for me, why that I think we can't just vote. It would be wrong, and I'm not suggesting you're saying this, to focus simply on the bread and butter issues. It is about the broader political stuff as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to say a word about the question of power. I was also late for the meeting tonight because I'm also a UCU rep at Imperial College London, and I was late because I'm organising a climate event next week, actually a debate on the somewhat obscure sounding issue of carbon capture and storage and the role that actually plays in the climate transition. The reason I mention that is because that debate is going to be between two people, one of whom thinks that it's possible to be able to make the climate transition within capitalism and without getting rid of fossil fuel industry. The other is going to be arguing that there's an absolute primacy for taking on fossil fuel companies because they're absolutely the most important and powerful forces inside of modern day capitalism. But secondly, if we actually want to save the climate and we want to save the planet, then that's going to be absolutely necessary. Now, the reason I mention that is because we had a climate summit last December at which several of the key activists afterwards, we went to the pub and had a chat afterwards. And I didn't know many of them, so a lot of them are first-year students, a lot of them are new to the university, and a lot of them are a hell of a lot younger than me. And some of them didn't remember the Labour Party's campaign in 2016. But I found out that 4 of the 5 were all going around campaigning for the Labour Party. And they didn't remember what happened in 2016 when you had these mass rallies up and down the country where Jeremy Corbyn was actually enthusing the masses to go and take the arguments to the doorstep in a much more collective and insurgent manner than I think happened this time around. And I was saying to them that don't you feel really that that's something that would have transformed your expectations and hopes on the doorstep this time around, rather than this kind of more presidential campaign that's been run. And I think that that really goes to the heart of what's going on at the moment now, because the climate campaign for me is about raising the whole debate about how you can get the change we need. How do we get the society we need? I don't think it's actually possible to actually win the change we need to save the planet, to save the climate, by actually going along with the capitalist imperatives. If we want to take on the power of capitalist rapers and pillagers of the planet, like the fossil fuel companies, then that requires taking on power that is not elected, that is not accountable, and is accountable only to the mass power of workers in the workplace who have, after all, the ability to control the wealth that these people actually at the moment have control of. And that, to me, is a key. So when it comes to our strike, which is starting on the 20th of February, it is in the interest of every single activist, whether they're active in the climate or over anti-racism or any other issue, to come along and put fire in our bellies and get fire in your own bellies in order to bring together these fights and enhance the power and the ability of every single one of them to make these links that are crucial, I think, in order to build the case for revolutionary transformation that I think we all need to fight for.
To bring back our first speaker, Josh Holland from the UCU, to sum up.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that was a really good and useful discussion to have. And I think people are absolutely right to say that we have to take stock of the election. I think that's true. And we're right to say that we've got to push back against cuts, whether they be Tory cuts or whether it's the Labour Party driving them through locally. And I think people are right to say that we need to push back to defend academic freedom and also freedom for Palestine. And I think, the UCU strikes, UCU striker Roddy did a very good call out to you all there, but please do come down. I mean, one of the things that we really want to do, we don't want to be out on the streets. We don't want to have to be, but if we are going to be, then we're going to be drawing our students out as well. We're going to be saying we're going to take this as an educational opportunity to say, okay, our dispute might be over casualisation or pensions or pay, but it's actually about the future of education. And actually, as we've heard tonight, it's about the future of society. Are we going to have a planet to live on in the next few decades or not? But I think people are also right, and I think this is something Mark said and a few others, that we can't pick our battles in this period. In fact, this is a moment in which we have to draw all of these strands together, and I think that's something that's been really successful in UCU. For several years, we couldn't actually get over that threshold, the anti-union threshold on a pay strike. But when we connected it with anti-casualisation, when we connected it to the race pay gap, the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap, and our pensions, we managed to get over the line. But I also think, there's a reason why our action is escalating. We actually had 14 days of action in 2018, 8 days of action in last November, December, and now 14 more days of action. And that's because when we did 1 or 2 days of symbolic action before on these issues, when we did manage to get over the threshold, in fact, our employers just ignored us, really. And that's one of the reasons why we're in this situation now. And so we need to have, escalating action, and we need to be drawing these strands together. But to do that, and Roddy's right, and the rest of you are right, we need solidarity. We do need you to come down to our picket lines. Please bring support, bring solidarity. We're in a moment now where we are escalating, but to be able to do that, we're having to take massive hits to pay. And so, please do dig deep. Send around a collection sheet and come down. But it's also about marching together and demonstrating. And, one of the most inspiring parts of the last round of action was actually 1 day strike coincided with the school strikers. And it was so inspiring to march together and really, to put into action that old, chant of students and workers united will never be defeated. And also, striking together with public sector workers over pay and with all of us marching against racism on the 21st of March. And so I think we can be down, we can take stock of where we're at, but actually in this moment, as people said tonight, we have to push forward and outwards, and we have to rebuild organisation, socialist organisation and trade union organisation in every workplace. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome back Noga from UKSEN.
Hi. I think that the majority of us are pretty much on the same page. I think that this discussion has been phenomenally helpful in actually all of us realising that we have come to the same understanding. We are all prepared to unite and to organise. We are all prepared to do so from the grassroots to a national level. And so I have, instead of that, one more rallying call, which is, well, I'm 18. I am probably the youngest person in the room. And it should not be that way. And I think all of us have a great responsibility within the next 5 years to allow for the next round of resistance when it's needed, to ensure that the next generation are prepared to fight the next round of political apocalypse or whatever impending disasters we may face. And so what we need to do now is establish that level of education, to teach kids and people much younger than me and my age also, not just about the interconnectivity of social issues such as climate change, that climate justice is migrant justice, is racial justice, but that we can unite, we can organise. Recently, several studies have been conducted and have shown that young people recognise the disasters of late-stage capitalism, but have no faith in the power of trade unions, have no understanding of the politics that goes into organising, and fail to recognise the power of organising together, of standing in solidarity. And that's something that I believe we all in this room can change and have a responsibility to change, to teach and to educate every young person in our lives, whether they are a Tory or were a Tory or are already Labour members or supporters or simply people in our workplace. That is a responsibility that we all have, to take that forward and to teach the next generation to be prepared and to learn to organise and to resist on our own. Because in 40, 50 years' time, we won't be able to rely on having organisers who created this space, and we'll have to generate our own. And that's something we all have a responsibility to pass on, to perpetuate the intergenerational connectivity that has brought us to this space in itself. And that's something that I think we can all pass on and take hope from.
Next, I'd like to welcome back Mark Serwotka, the General Secretary of PCS Union.
So, I mean, that's been an excellent discussion. I just a few observations. I mean, we essentially had a debate there about reform or revolution in reality. And I think, and I loved the slogan, unite and argue, because I think that is absolutely should be where we are in a minute. We want to unite in the struggle. Clearly, we've tried to put in focus here global events like climate change, trade union struggle. We haven't even touched on the anti-race, well, we mentioned it, but the anti-racist struggle. You know, we have to unite in activity. But we do need to have the debate and argue, because whilst I utterly accept, and I'm going to be quite clear about it, probably more than any other union leader, my view is your job is to organise workers to go on strike, whoever attacks you. And when that's Labour councils, you fight Labour councils. If that is a Labour government, you fight the Labour government. And if that is a Labour assembly, so I wouldn't want us to divide on the question that therefore wanting a Labour government can make you soft on your attitude to opposing Labour in power. I also think that whilst I think we have all agreed here, it's not about waiting for 5 years, it is about fighting in the here and now. I have no doubt in 5 years' time, the general election will be a critical issue for socialists. It doesn't mean we don't care about what happens in 5 years, it's that we don't put things off. So what I'm keen is we have that discussion about what it means in practice. I agree entirely with the RMT comrade about, the London mayoral election would be important. Our union came out, and it was an important battle that we had, defeating what I think were sectarians who said the general election is not important and the union should stay out of it. We said Corbyn in power was important, but we don't say vote Labour in council elections, mayoral elections, or anything else. So we are able, I think, to try and have a sophisticated argument about why politics is important, but it shouldn't distract you from the struggle. And I think that is a debate for us to carry on having. Candy raised the point. I'll get to this two things then. Candy raised a point that I think is key about what happened to Corbyn's army. Because the rise of momentum and the rise of Labour's membership did not correlate with many people who joined Labour who did not get active in their union. We've seen figures today in the civil service. The level of union membership in the under 30s is woeful. So there is a disconnect between some people wanting to be radical politically and not industrially, And we need to ensure that we combine politics, I think, with that radicalism. So my final point, therefore, is so much unites us, but there is a debate to have. And I think that that is the critical thing we must do whilst getting into activity. No one's mentioned it, but I think one of the big mobilizing things that will cause a political crisis would be the call for Scottish independence, the demand for a second referendum, and Johnson's belief he can oppose it, which I think is going to give huge opportunities for the radical socialist left to get involved in. So I'll leave with this thought. That debate is important. We owe it to ourselves to ensure we also go past some of our old slogans. I think in the unions, we need to see the activity. We need to digest why there's more local strikes than ever, but there's no national strikes, and why that is and how we get around the laws. We should also ask ourselves, that within the unions, we know that many people who are frontline lay shop stewards have themselves subjected to pressures and bureaucracies that often mean in our union, our members are often prepared to be more radical than some of our shop stewards. These are debates the socialists must have and how we relate to them. But I'll finish where I started. Debate and argument's critical because we want a better world and a better future and we want to win. But if we only debate and don't struggle, we're not doing anybody any good. So unite and argue, I like that. Let's talk about these issues, but let's now ensure the climate strike is huge with all of us involved. We are out there fighting against racism. We are out there defending refugees, the right for freedom of movement. We're supporting the UCU, the CWU, and everyone else. And whilst we're doing all of that, if we can argue for coordinated national strikes, it could transform the mood in every workplace and town in Britain. So let's get on and argue for that as well.
Now, just to introduce our final speaker before we wrap up the event, Charlie Kimber, the editor of Socialist Worker.
Someone said it's not a time for taking step backwards. I think that's absolutely true. Let me give you one example. The Palestinian people face yet another serious assault from the plan that Trump and Netanyahu have pushed through and that they're now going to try and impose. It's essentially giving the Israeli government everything that it wants in the situation in front of it. It's a very, very serious assault. Somebody has to stand up for the Palestinian people, to continue the BDS campaign, to put forward the arguments. It worries me greatly that every one of the candidates for the Labour leadership have accepted the Board of Deputies' 10-point plan, which essentially outlaws solidarity with the Palestinian people. We have to not just have the right to say it, but say very clearly that Zionism is a racist project, that the State of Israel was founded by imperialism as a way of oppressing the Palestinian people and implanting imperialism in the Middle East. It's right to say those things. It's right to organise, and it worries me, therefore, that there is a retreat over those sorts of politics. And regrettably, that is the result of the anti-Semitism slurs and the compromises with them. My second point is that the contradiction of Corbynism was this. Jeremy Corbyn was a massive boost for everybody on the left. It made socialist arguments easier. It made it possible to put forward arguments about not austerity light, but about a break from austerity, about not just giving in towards arguments against refugees, but standing up for refugees. It made all that possible. But the contradiction of it was that for many people, getting Corbyn elected became everything. And the struggle at the base of society and the struggle on the streets and the workplaces was postponed or was regarded as unnecessary. And that, I think, was disastrous, because the wellspring of radicalism, the wellspring of unity, comes when people do things themselves, not just when they look at things that are happening in the Labour Party or in Parliament. And therefore, we have to insist that whatever's going on in the Labour Party, that the critical thing is the activity that's happening at the base of society. And that's the crucial difference, I think, between different political perspectives around those sorts of questions. My third point is this. Jeremy Corbyn, regrettably, was broken even before he got into 10 Downing Street. Had he got into 10 Downing Street, the resistance from the rich, from the international financial institutions, from the banks and so on, would have been absolutely huge. But we know as well that if you look at the examples of Syriza in Greece, or François Hollande in France, or Podemos in Spain, you can see this process whereby reformist governments are broken by that. And that's not just about the personality of people, it's about whether you root your politics in the struggle or whether you root it in Parliament. Therefore, we have to have this discussion while at the same time having an absolute focus on unity in action. And we need that unity more than ever. My final point is this: we don't just need a movement against racism. We don't just need a movement against austerity. We don't just need a movement against climate change. We don't just need a movement to get a high level of resistance inside society, though we do need all of those things. We don't just need a movement against imperialist war. We don't just need a movement against LGBT phobia. We don't just need a movement for women's liberation, though we do need all of those things. We need something that brings all of those things together and says, this is what capitalism means. It means poverty, it means climate chaos, it means racism, it means war, and we need to get rid of capitalism. And that's why I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. It's why I think you should be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. We need to fight for a different sort of society which offers emancipation and hope for all of us. Thank you.